Well, once upon a time, when creation abounded, soul was so important that, why, it seemed the skalds, the storytellers, just assumed that soul would always be traversing across the sky, along with her brother, the moon or Mani. Why, that's how it came to pass when Odin and his brothers Vili and Vi, when they lifted up the great bones of the frost giant, the first of them, Ymir, and carried them out to make earth. Why, already Sol made her travels across the sky as Odin and Vili and Vi stretched the great skin of the frost giant to become the land, and squeezed out the huge fallen giant's blood to become the oceans, the rivers, the lakes, and the seas. And then they set up bones, ones that weren't broken, to form the mountains, again while beautiful, radiant soul traversed the sky. More and more had been made. Places were designated for the great gods, the giants, the dwarves, the elves, and men, women, to live. Asgard was the place for mankind and for their dwelling. They were given the brain of the great frost giant, or at least the skull. And there, people who had come forth from a great fallen tree, where two of the branches became the first human beings, those human beings let many human beings dwell in Asgard. So, after a time, when day and night had been created, and too many things now to account for, but if you were to look about and to imagine anything you might see, hear, feel, or touch, you would know that it had been made. This is why it seemed to Odin and Vili and Vi outrageous when a mere human being, Mundilfari, I believe was his name, had two children and had the audacity, because of their brilliance and luster, to name them Sun and Moon. Yes, of course, she had radiant hair like the sun and glowed forth with a beauty which, why, perhaps would have made the sun blush. But to name a human girl Sol, it offended Odin and his brothers. And Mundilfari complicated things by naming his handsome son, who seemed to have a handsome kind of a face, all throughout the night in his travels, that he felt himself like the moon. Odin took exception to this and lifted up the two children, snatching them in his very hands and throwing them to become the sun and the moon. And then, perhaps in his wisdom, which he gained through a horrible ordeal, he decided it would be necessary for the sun and the moon to keep pace, to keep their travels, to bring a time for us to know when it was to be day and night, to bring a time for us to know when to plant, when to sleep, when to meet, when to do a myriad of things, and to keep the sun and the many-faced moon moving. A pair of wolves were unleashed, and they were to chase the chariots of horses, pulling the sun and the moon in their travels across the sky. The wolves would howl relentlessly at all times, and the sun, the beautiful, radiant woman who was now consumed by the flames, scarce had time herself, though she was meant to be the one to whom all would look to tell time, why the elves, their name for her in their language was that of time teller. But now this bright one, this shining one, this radiant, beautiful form could scarce look down upon the doings of elves and dwarves and giants and gods and human beings. The wolves, ow, 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 howled right behind her, their tongues reaching out and drooling their saliva upon the burning sun, who kept the reins going forward. The only time she could rest, 'twas when it was her brother, the moon, to lift his handsome faces and move across the sky. And he too wanted to look upon the marvels of creation. He wanted to see how Ymir the frost giant's skin had been stretched and folded into all manner of land, which now was graced with farms. But little could he do to even glimpse that, for the wolves, ow, 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 howled, and he had to keep the reins of that chariot pulled by the horses, moving him in his travels across the sky. Now, some of the skalds, the storytellers, will claim, and as a storyteller, I must declare that we all may be prone to, well, being forced to exaggerate in order to best tell the truth. This may have been what happened, so I will then report that some say, on occasion, the wolves would get hold of Mani, the moon, and would devour a part of him, a half of him, and what seemed to be the all of him. His sister then would need to rise burning bright, and before she could make her rounds, she would lean back with a ray of light and strike the wolf in the stomach, causing him to spit out Sol's brother Mani, the moon, only to again suffer the same fate. Month after month, year after year, millennia after millennia. Will ever it end? Oh yes, Ragnarok, the end of it all. That none of the gods, the giants, the dwarves, the elves, nor human beings wanted, but they knew 'twould come. But you know who wanted? That great battle, that war to destroy all? The ones who were here first, whose presence seemed not even to need a full proper story. Sol and Mani, sun and moon, when they were traveling across the sky, and all living things were counting on them to illuminate and to give warmth and light and mystery. They were wanting an end to their misery. And thus, when they travel, even now, do you know what they're praying for? Ragnarok, the great battle, which will, yea, destroy all. But when the jaws of the enormous wolf are released, then the other wolves will be able to get the sun and the moon. And now they will then be glad. They'll have their rest, because when the great battle comes and all settles, sun and moon will end their ceaseless travels across the skies, and they will come to find peace. And perhaps when our great battle ends, and when the sun no longer seems as though it will never set, and when the moon looks as though it will run out of faces, then we, in their way, will enjoy the peace too. But for now, let's continue to let our light be bright, burning like the sun, and let's also try and give forth as many faces as does Mani, the moon. And good friends, that's a story of the sun ever shining now and the moon of many faces from the Norse mythology. Thanks very much for listening.